Hello and welcome to the Leaders in Supply Chain and Logistics podcast. I'm your host, Radu Palamariu, Group CEO of Velvet Global. Our mission is to connect the supply chain ecosystem by bringing forward some of the most interesting leaders in the industry.
I'm delighted to have with us today Patrick McGee. Patrick is a close contact. I remember fondly when we met about two years and a half ago in a coffee place in San Francisco, and we were talking about his project of writing a book. Well, that book has come to life. That book is now called Apple in China. It is a book that has been hailed as absolutely riveting, a once-in-a-generation read. It's a book that I've read in 2-3 days, and I couldn't leave it out of my I let it out of my hands because it's just an incredible, well-written story of how Apple grew and became what it is through massive operations in China. So that's why I thought to invite Patrick here today with us and to share more. Patrick, great to have you.
Thanks so much, Radu. Yeah, I was here two years ago, right? This is our second podcast together, so it's nice to come full circle.
It's full circle. So also maybe as a background, Patrick has written for many years about Apple. He's a reporter. He's been a reporter with the Financial Times. He's covered Apple since 2019 to 2023. So he knows a lot about the company. And now with this book, he really brought to the light of the world, really, what happened and how did Apple do their supply chain in a way that it is built today, heavily reliant on China. Now, maybe as a first question to you, Patrick, and to start off, what really shocked me was when I was reading the book and I realized how much money had Apple invested in building manufacturing capabilities through their different providers, not directly, obviously, but through their different providers in China. It was a number close to 50 billion a year for 5, 6, 7 years, which, to put things into perspective, and I hope I'm not misspeaking, is larger than all of the CHIPS Act in the US per annum. So they were investing that for 5 to 7 years in China. So by far building the capabilities, the manufacturing, the skills of people to ultimately build the best electronics in the world. And in that process, they upskilled the whole Chinese manufacturing electronics ecosystem. So you can argue, and I think that's what I got from the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, that China manufacturing power was disproportionately influenced positively by Apple. So let's start there and tell us what you think.
Yeah, so let me give you the sort of crux of the argument, and then I'll backtrack a little bit. So yeah, the argument really is that Apple is the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025, which is an audacious anti-Western plan on the part of Beijing, or you could say Xi Jinping directly in 2015, to within a decade sever China's reliance on the West for robotics, advanced electronics, automation, some other sectors that I don't go into, like pharmaceuticals. And so to say that Apple's supportive of that plan at all is kind of a big deal. And to say that they're the biggest supporter really of any entity, corporation or country on the planet, should sound a little unhinged. I mean, you're sort of not getting it if you think this is a rational thought. You have to be convinced of this. So if the reader is already lost and thinking that doesn't sound right, then you're at least getting the significance of what is being said here. So the thing that I don't think people get, and certainly I didn't understand, is that it's one thing to say that Apple is stuck in China, that there's no place on the planet that could provide the same quantity, quality, and cost. I don't even know what the counter argument to that is. I mean, that's pretty clear. And that's what I thought the book was going to argue. Instead, based on the 200 plus interviews of current and former Apple people that I did for the book, I realized that, really the narrative they told me was that Apple isn't just dependent on capabilities it found in China. It's dependent on capabilities it created in China. And that's where you begin to realize that, okay, Apple works differently from really any other electronics company. If you're a Dell, an HP, even a Samsung, you're basically working with a bunch of suppliers who innovate on their own. You're hoping that they come up with more durable, lighter materials, etc., something that will put your next phone to just be a little bit better than the previous year. Apple, of course, does that for some components, but for the majority of its key components, it is sending engineers from a division called Manufacturing Design, or MD, who sort of are trying to respond to the crazy things that in the golden age of Apple, Johnny Ive and Steve Jobs are coming up with. And they were creating the competencies in Asia. So they were literally going to factories by the plane load and doing what one Apple engineer called the Apple swarm effect, where just these engineers would just descend on some factory where there's already some sense of technical capability, but Apple would train the hell out of the whole team time until they could reach the quantity and scale and the quality and scale that Apple really needed. And when Apple was a small company in the late 1990s, they were actually still having a pretty big effect on places like Taiwan. But Apple basically gets really big and it has to move to China. And this is just after China's entered the WTO. So there's sort of this perfect marriage of skill and scale, if you will. And then we're sort of off to the races once the iPod mini goes berserk, and then once the iPhone comes on board. And you begin to realize that in order for Apple to fulfill this like insatiable demand around the world, it ends up spending billions upon billions of dollars in these factories, training millions of workers and buying, billions of dollars worth of machinery, mounting it in these suppliers' factories, and then training teams how to actually use it. So we can get into how much is spent there, but like just to get the listener on board with understanding like what we're even talking about, when Apple is investing, they're investing in these facilities to build the tech competence necessary to meet Apple's quantity demands and cost demands and quality demands.
And you made a point in the book, and again, it stuck with me as an analogy. You're not making. I mean, it's the iPhone and what went as a technology at the time, and all the innovations and the things they did around the iPhone. It was really like building Ferraris at scale. So that's an analogy that I loved about. Or I remember you mentioning in the book something to that extent. And what
Yes.
that meant to my head, at least, is that you needed a lot of people to be able to do something that is incredibly technologically advanced and pushing the boundaries. And that skill set, you needed it in mass, and they were able somehow to do that, and by that to train a lot of other people that then on obviously worked on other products in China for other companies, and then kind of upskill over time the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, so let me try to put this in 90 seconds or so. So you have to know that Apple is different from all the other PC companies in the 80s and 90s because unlike most of the others, its DNA was really formed out of two guys in a garage tinkering with the circuit boards and the basis of a computer and building it themselves. IBM is like that in that they build everything themselves, but the IBM PC project is not. It is basically a bandaged together computer of existing parts and components, and the IBM PC very much gives rise to Taiwan and Korea as these companies that can really build all sorts of components at scale. So IBM very much gives up manufacturing in order to get the PC in motion. And then even more to the point, the likes of Compaq or Dell, everyone that calls themselves a PC clone maker, they really don't have manufacturing in their bones in the same way that Apple does. I mean, a company like Dell, I don't want to discredit Dell. Dell does a lot of its manufacturing even today, but they don't have the same design aesthetic. They don't have the same boundary pushing idea that someone like Johnny Ive would bring to the table. And so Apple is very reluctant to adopt outsourcing when the rest of the PC industry does it. And the PC wars in the 80s and 90s are really boring from a Steve Jobs perspective, let's just say, because it's all about distribution and manufacturing efficiency, right? It's all this wonky supply chain stuff, basically the stuff that Tim Cook is good at. But Steve Jobs never really cared for that. But of course, you got to remember, there's no good designs in PCs outside of Apple in the 1990s, right? I mean, just writ large, there is no good computer that is well designed. They're all beige boxes, right? I don't think I'm going to get any calls to, correct me on that. And they're all running Windows, of course, and they're all running Intel chips. So the competition really is just in this wonky stuff, which, to be fair, is amazing for consumers because that war is what drives down prices and makes them affordable for the masses. But on its way, it nearly bankrupts Apple. Apple is no longer able to compete with them. And once Windows 95 emerges, there's really no particular reason to pay a premium price for the Mac. It's no longer doing anything special at that point. The Mac was basically 10 years ahead of its time in 1984, but by 1995, it's basically almost lights out for Apple. I mean, I think for the first time, that around April 1996, they have hired a bankruptcy lawyer because it's so clear that the company is going to go under. How they get out of it, I'll leave to the reader who wants to go get the book. But basically, they're able to raise some money, sell a factory, and then they throw this Hail Mary pass and get Steve Jobs involved. When Steve Jobs comes on board, he hires Tim Cook, the senior vice president of operations, who's of course now CEO. And there's a 7-year narrative that I don't think had ever been told, where Apple's experimenting with contract manufacturers in about 9 different countries. So the translucent iMac that everyone remembers was actually built first out of South Korea by LG, and then they expand to Mexico and Wales. And Foxconn gets brought on board in a really interesting way that sort of, destines the fate of both Foxconn and Apple, right? This is a really important thing that I'm hating to skip over, but I'm trying to give you the quick history. Foxconn comes on board, and Foxconn's Taiwanese, but they build the iMac for Apple in China, but also in the Czech Republic and also in California. And it's only after this 7-year narrative of all these countries, also including Singapore and Taiwan, where the abundant labor of China and frankly the industrial policy of China really wins out. But Apple, and this is the crucial point, is only willing to adopt outsourcing writ large if they can maintain like the DNA of we build it ourselves. So they don't just adopt outsourcing in the sense of, we come up with the blueprints and someone takes care of it. They find a new model that I don't think we have a word for, and maybe you do because you're more into the wonky supply chain than I am, Radu. But basically, they find a way to. I compare it to Uber. Like Uber is the largest taxi network in the world without owning any cars, and that's what Apple does. They become the world's largest manufacturer without owning any factories, and so it's like they own the factories. Like that's how much control and command they take, but they don't actually do it. And so the story is really like, how did they pull that off in the years that lead up to then the iPhone?
And of course, we let the reader read the details, but I do want to go deeper into Foxconn because to me that was fascinating. And so first, I mean, just to give everybody a preamble, the contract manufacturing industry, you were saying it actually started in the company in Alabama, and there was a bunch of things that evolved. Again, I had no clue that LG at the beginning was helping Apple on top of they were making different parts and monitors and so on. They were actually the first ones that they had the first hit with to try to partner, and then they basically dropped the ball on a few things, and then they let Foxconn in, who over time took over. But tell us a little bit in a summarization manner, what did Foxconn do so well, and are there some some mind-blowing things or facts or things that most people don't know that made Foxconn so successful to partner with Apple over such a long period of time?
It's funny. I talked to lots of people, and unless you were early days in Foxconn, like in terms of being an Apple person that worked with Foxconn, people basically had no idea why Foxconn had become like the assembly partner for Apple. And so, in a sense, solving the riddle of this was really a key thing in the first few months of the book. And it was really just that, like, the reason why it's called Con, right? Foxconn is for connector. I mean, it's a company that goes back to 1976, and they did lots of interesting things. But basically, if you were at Apple in the mid 90s, you just knew Foxconn as the connector company. Little connectors inside the computer, nothing special, nothing fancy. But they're very ambitious, and the founder of the company, Terry Guo, really recognizes something early in Apple that nobody else gets. And what he gets is that the way that Apple's redefining the aesthetics of the computer is pushing design to the limits, which means that to conjure it into reality at hundreds of thousands per quarter, they're pushing their engineers to the limits. And so he realizes that if we work with Apple, they're going to teach us how to do all of this stuff because there's zero expectation on the part of Apple that anybody in the supply chain knows how to do translucent plastic and all this like high-tech plastic injection molding. And so Apple trains people by sending people out to Gumi, Korea, sending them out to the Czech Republic and teaching them hand in glove how to do all this stuff. And because the companies are often like, really low margin. They don't have money for big research and development projects. That's why Apple begins buying the machinery themselves and installs it in the factories. So Terrigo basically recognizes the implications of this, that if I embed my teams into Apple projects, they are going to get free, like tuition-free engineering training. And he begins to be so clever with this that sometimes what would happen is someone like Tony Fadell working on an iPod project for Apple would come in one day and recognize 0 people that are in the factory. And it's because Foxconn's Terry Guo had just rotated the entire group. So it's like a new semester had started at Apple University, and Foxconn, just had all these new students show up, and Professor Fidel basically had to take on this new cohort. And so Terry's just able to, I mean, you can't underestimate him. I mean, the only real comparison is someone like Henry Ford, 100 years earlier, 120 years earlier in America. I mean, he just has this outsized impact on turning Shenzhen from a series of fishing villages in the early 1980s to a megapolis by the size of, the size of New York by 2007 or so. And today, really the size of Greater London. I think it's 18 million people or so. So he plays this massive sort of impact for Apple, but obviously on his own business as well. But the other thing that's not really known is Apple isn't just at the time outsourcing their assembly operations to Foxconn. They're outsourcing their political connections because Terry Guo, like nobody else, is really working the Chinese government to be able to expand his empire, if you will. And in the process, he's got these quid pro quo deals running where because he's going to hire all these people and give growth to like the local cadres. And this is where you need an understanding of how Chinese communism is different from Soviet communism. It is not top down the way that a lot of Westerners think. It's very much sort of like top down is the directive, but then there's all these local cadres who get incentivized to bring growth to their area. And so Terry Guo is working hand in glove with these provincial and city officials. And his mode of doing labor intensive work means that he needs more people, needs more of a footprint. And so he ends up parlaying these political connections to turn Apple orders into free machinery, free tooling, and to get access to migrant pools of labor and whatnot. So although Apple at this time, and really until 2012, 2013, doesn't have a great understanding of Chinese politics, its key partner, Foxconn, absolutely does in a way that takes Apple a long time to understand that, wait a minute, there's great benefit to having all these political connections, right? This Guangxi. And so if we are sort of allowing this key partner of ours to sort of take credit for orders that are ultimately traced back to the iPhone, the iPod, the iPad, we're doing ourselves a disservice because nobody understands that like this is our money, this is our capital, this is our investment. And so, the narrative really drives up to this political awakening where Apple has to take full control of its politics. But this, I mean, there's just so many stories in this book that have never been told before. And, what I try to convey to people on a podcast is that like this is like a 35-year history to really explain how this company goes from days from bankruptcy to the world's most valuable company and becomes an operational Goliath, the likes of which we've never really seen, but without doing any of the manufacturing itself. And that requires political connections and that requires all sorts of other deals and stuff. So yeah, it is just a fascinating narrative. And I think it's pretty unlike any other Apple book that's ever been published.
No, I completely agree. And I need to ask you now this question because I love the framing of the question.
Yeah.
A lot of people say Apple is a product company, privacy company, whatever.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit. I read the book. After digging 200 interviews and all of this, would you say it's actually, if you think about it from this perspective, a geopolitical actor?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, to put it in personal terms, Tim Cook is absolutely as much a statesman as he is a CEO, right? I mean, you think about who might succeed Tim Cook. What skill set does that person need? I mean, for starters, it'd be great if they had a little bit of Steve Jobs, right? It'd be great if you had someone that was a product visionary. Apple needs that after a 14-year hiatus, right? But they also need to be an absolute operational, a serious operations person. They need to understand the supply chain. They need to understand the hardware and the engineering. I mean, this person would have to be an engineer. They also need to understand the marketing. But then among the biggest tasks, I mean, at the same time, you've got to placate Brussels, Narendra Modi in India, Xi Jinping in Beijing, and Donald Trump in the United States. I mean, that is so part and parcel of the job. That is really tough to find someone with that skill set. But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the whole point of the book is to take seriously the notion that journalists have been writing, but I think without taking seriously for years now, which is that Apple is the size of a medium nation state in terms of how much revenue and profit it brings in. And yet, I think the book is really the first book length, what am I trying to say? Book length treatise, I don't know what I would say, so, like object to really take seriously the
Mm.
idea that if it is indeed, a $3 or $4 trillion company with these worldwide impacts, then surely wherever it moves, it's causing massive ripples, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is too often in the media, we've written the simple story, which is looking at Apple at 3 trillion and just deciding how many JP Morgan Chases you could fit inside, right? Or how many companies in the S&P 500 does it take to add up to that, right? We're doing cutesy little graphics instead of really understanding, like we're talking about a company that has parallels to like the Dutch East India Company. Like this is the level of company that we're working
Mm.
with. And so the book takes that idea really seriously. So to come back with what you were saying earlier, by the time of 2015, Apple does its own supply chain study and realizes that it's investing $55 billion a year into Apple. And because there are no corporate equivalents of how much the company is spending on another country, I had to look at government efforts. And so the CHIPS Act is one that you mentioned, where, yeah, the CHIPS Act is $52 billion over 4 years. That's how much Congress allocated. And the Commerce Secretary called it a once in a generation investment. So Apple in a different country is spending that per year. The other comparison I make is to the Marshall Plan. And most people, at least in America, would know the Marshall Plan from like the grade 9 textbook, where after World War II, America spends this huge amount of money. I think it's equivalent to 5% of American GDP at the time to really help 16 countries in Europe come out of the post-World War II recession, let's say. And plays just an instrumental role, right? I believe it's been called like the most generous gift from one country to another in the history of humanity. Well, Apple was spending double that per annum in a single country rather than 16, and not on a diversified set of initiatives like food aid and agricultural revival and building highways and railways, but in the advanced electronics sector. And so Apple has this just absolutely punch above its weight impact on China, building up the thing that's considered the most desirable thing for Xi Jinping, right? Made in China 2025. How can China get ahead in the advanced electronics sector? And the proof of in the pudding, if you will, is that the Chinese absolutely dominate in smartphones. And I don't just mean their supply chains. I mean Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi. They have more than 55% market share globally in smartphones. And what's a smartphone? It's the most iconic device of the 21st century. And the only two players at volume really are Samsung and Apple. And of course, Apple's all in China. So yeah, they basically train up their whole supply chain for their own purposes. But the results of that is the supply chain takes what they know and they give it to the most Chinese-like Apple brands. And so Apple sort of trained up its own competitors is really sort of where you get the narrative going. It's
Yeah,
pretty incredible.
it's unbelievable. And there's a lot of talk about diversification. I also want to ask you a little bit on that, the diversification of Apple, right? And they said, oh,
Yeah.
they went a bit in Vietnam, they went a bit in India. Oh, India is going to be the next China. Isn't it really symbolic for now and also for the foreseeable future? Because even if you take India, which, okay, at scale, you can say that the population is similar to China, the ecosystem is not there. Yeah, I mean, there's I don't know if Foxconn wants to go to India. They might want to go to India, but it's not at all the same. You're not talking about the same proportions. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, there's so many things worth unpacking here. So one of them is that, it's not good enough whether this is, in Pittsburgh at the behest of Donald Trump or Karnataka either at the behest of Narendra Modi or indeed at the behest of Tim Cook. But there are no Apple factories to open. At best, Apple can convince its suppliers, right? Tell their suppliers, we need you to move here, right? Okay, and maybe they can do so. But if you are Foxconn and you're being told to set up a new factory anywhere on the planet, you're not going to be efficient if you're just supplying Apple products. Apple doesn't need you most of the year, right? Apple needs up to 400,000 people in Zhengzhou alone assembling iPhones for the first 8 to 10 weeks of an iPhone coming out. And then things taper off. And so, like the supply chain within China alone, Apple has about 8 or 900,000 people in March. That's the quote unquote labor demand, according to some internal documents I have. And then it ramps up to around 1.8 million for an iPhone launch. So the number of temp workers that Apple takes on is literally in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, it's just absolutely gargantuan. But what are those people doing when they're not building Apple products? Well, to some extent, they're floating around from one factory to another, but to some extent, they're floating within the factory and they're working on Sony or Panasonic or Samsung or whatever the case may be. So if you're going to have a factory either in Pittsburgh or Karnataka, it can't just be working for Apple. It needs to be working for, dozens of other companies. That is what makes Foxconn so damn efficient because they have all these resources and they always know where to put them, right? They're always doing something. That's what makes manufacturing as a service, right? The whole basis of contract manufacturing so effective because if you're Apple, you can't have all these people sitting on your balance sheet, all these workers who are paid overtime when the orders are there and then aren't being paid at all because there's no products to build. So if you're Foxconn, you never have that problem because you just have enough clients that you're always rotating them around. So that's one thing that people don't understand. And so it's not just a question for Foxconn, it's a question for all the industrial clusters that form around Foxconn. So if Foxconn's just doing assembly, and they often do more than that, but let's just say they just do assembly, around the Foxconn assembly factory, you need metal tooling, metal stamping, plastic injection molding, 3 dozen other things. And the value of a Chinese industrial cluster is not only are all of those things around the factory, multiples of those things are all around the factory. So Apple can play one against the other and maybe two against the third. And so to move all of this is just incredibly difficult. And so it doesn't really matter per se that Indian labor rates are even lower than China's right now, because you can't just move a little bit at a time. You would sort of have to move all of it. And yet, unless you have a geopolitical crisis, like your export license has been canceled, you're not going to do it. And then, even if you really wanted to do it, Beijing doesn't want you to do it. And Washington doesn't want you to do it. So Washington can just basically say to Tim Cook, as he did, I don't want you moving to India. So who knows what the implications of that are going to be. But that's tough. 25% tariff essentially is what he's done. And then Beijing can basically just make sure that you don't move. Like the Chinese people with experiential know-how that need visa to go to New Delhi, well, not going to happen. We're just not giving out the visas, right? This was reported in January. A lot of the machinery that's needed on the production line, Beijing has basically just said, yeah, we're not going to export it, right? So that's really tough. And then even if Apple sort of surreptitiously went behind their back and did things, I'm not suggesting they are, but if they did that, Beijing can just do things like factory runs out of electricity every Wednesday, or whatever the case may be. They don't even have to do anything explicit, as long as they're getting Apple engineers into the thought experiment of, wait a minute, is that roadblock, is that obstacle, is whatever went wrong today in China a result of that India press release that Tim Cook put out last week, right? That is the position that they will be in. So that's why I say in the subtitle, they're captured. I really do think they're stuck in China. I don't know what they're going to do. And I really hope that I'm wrong. I mean, I love Apple. I'm not gleeful at their predicament, but I really do think that's the predicament they're in.
Yeah, yeah, they are trapped. They are captured. Now, $1 million question: if you were Apple, what would you have advised them? Was there something that they could have done? Now it's clearly a little bit late, but could they have done something not to end up in this predicament where they are trapped in one country?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think yes, but let me give the critical view that says yes, and then the sympathetic view as to why it was so difficult. So the critical view is that the book opens with this episode where within 36 hours of Xi Jinping becoming president on March 14th, 2013, Apple is all of a sudden attacked in the media. CCTV goes after Apple for allegedly treating Chinese customers poorly with warranties that are sort of insufficient and are inferior to those in the rest of the world. Solving this riddle is one of the key things in the book, because this was covered by worldwide media 12 or 13 years ago. I don't think anybody ever understood why they were attacked. And I figured it out, and it's in the book, and I'm so proud that I somehow figured it out. It's a bit of a fluke. So I'm not going to reveal it here, and it's too long of a narrative too anyway. But the fact is Xi Jinping does not see the value of Apple. He sees it as an exploitative company. And Apple basically embarks on this 2 or 3 year mission to prove Xi Jinping wrong, to basically demonstrate it's true, we don't have any joint ventures in the country, we're not doing technology transfer in the way that you envision. But what they come up with is an argument that, look, we're working with 1,600 different factories, and we are working with them hand in glove, and we are teaching them the best engineering skills that we know how. And that's where Apple comes up with this $55 billion figure of how much they're just training, if not up-arming an entire class of manufacturing companies in the country. I can continue with the narrative of the book here, but I feel like I'm losing the thread on your question. Remind me where you wanted me to take that? Did you forget to?
Because I forgot as well.
I'm forgetting why I brought up CCTV.
Well, actually, no, I remember. The question was, what could they have done?
Oh yeah, what could they have done? What could they have done? Okay. So yeah, sorry. So this is where I don't go, because this is a counterfactual in the book. But I think when they were attacked, Apple's institutional thinking was, we need to double down in China and demonstrate all the ways in which we're helping them. I think that was the instance in which they could have said, oh, this is a real problem. On the one hand, we need to make it look like we're doubling down. On the other hand, we need a plan B. That they didn't come up with a plan B at that time, I think, is pretty astonishing. And I think because it's such a wake-up call for the company, and I think that's pretty demonstrated in the book, I do think that's the missing part. On the other hand, to give the sympathetic view, you have to realize that 2013 is when, like for starters, Tim Cook is still pretty new as CEO. Steve Jobs has only died 18 months ago. The pressure that he is under to sort of fulfill the dream that Steve Jobs had, right? The iPad is still a pretty new product at this time. The iPhone is really just becoming mature. I mean, that alone is huge. And then you have to realize the scale doesn't exist at that stage. It's still developing and it's almost exponential. So the iPhone goes from 5 million units in 2007 to almost a quarter billion by 2015. So 2013, when they're attacked, is really just in like the tail end period of this gargantuan building out of the supply chain. And Apple's under huge pressure because Android has really taken over the market in a way that actually panicked Apple in the early 2010s. And so I can understand that what they were going through was so difficult that if you said, by the way, guys, you also need to have your production in China and build it up in another country, that's I don't want to say it is too much. That's sort of speculative on my part, but I can understand that that would have felt like way too much and that they couldn't do it. But they're sort of reaping what they sow in a sense that like 10 years after the fact, they're just so ensconced in China that I just don't see any way out for them. And if there's a way out, it's at least 15 years and there's no guarantee. I mean, in a sense, the really optimistic conclusion would be if you could take me in a time machine to 2035, and by that point, Apple had a bifurcated supply chain where basically you could independently build from the raw materials on forward an iPhone in India and an iPhone in China, and they were basically the same in terms of price and quality. I mean, that would be an amazing outcome. I don't see anything like that happening. I wish I did. I would love to be proven wrong. I have got no ego in this at all. If I'm wrong about that, fantastic.
I also don't see that happening. And whether or not we see that happening, I 100%, 1000% guarantee I do not see the Chinese government allowing that to happen. And they are
Yeah,
very, very powerful in this.
I mean, you really have to understand, and this is why the epigraph to the book is a 2015 document from China that says, without manufacturing, there is no country, there is no nation. That is how seriously they take manufacturing. No other country on the planet sees it as like the guide or I've been saying on different podcasts, like China has like a Nietzschean will to power, and it's all based on manufacturing and control and technology. And they want the whole thing. They're not interested in giving up the low value manufacturing to another country that might have lower wages. They'll automate if they need to. They'll get more migrant labor if they need to. They'll move it to the inland if they need to, but they want to keep it. They've seen what happened to South Korea and Japan, and they're too big of a country for that to be for to let it happen. And they've got real leverage and power to make sure that certain laws aren't enforced and certain orders don't go away.
And I want to end on that. And now we're going up from Apple and the world order and geopolitics. But there's and to you the point that you just made, because I think on top of what you just said, China also knows how they got to the position of power that they're in by taking all that manufacturing and by doing it and fulfilling it when nobody else wanted to. Because let's be honest here for a second, the US and the European companies didn't go to China because they wanted to help China or whatever. They went because it was cheap, right? I mean, it's the capitalism playing out. What we are seeing is capitalism playing out and margins and so on. But now China is in such a strong position where it has become the manufacturing center of the world. And as you said, I mean, just on the topic of manufacturing and robotics, they installed more industrial robots last year than the whole world combined, all the countries of the whole world combined. So all this
Yeah.
marketing, mostly as far as I'm concerned, coming out of US, bring manufacturing back. So again, we are now in the geopolitical nations realm. So my question to
Yeah.
you is, how do you see this playing out? Because clearly now there's people talking about, new world order where the Chinese will be top of mind and the US slowly will fall under the second part. And it is a lot driven by manufacturing, and who owns it?
Well, in a way, that's the value of that, to go full circle on our conversation. That's the value of understanding how big Apple's investments alone have been in China, because that tells you that the CHIPS Act, which is the biggest thing America has done for its own high advanced, chips fabrication factories for the last quarter century. I mean, that is not coming close to what China is doing, because China's investments, the dollars they give out in loans to the industrial sector in China are just off the charts. I mean, we're just nowhere close. In other words, even when we think it's like pedal to the metal, we're reindustrializing America, it's like we're not even close to the scale that Apple's got. Now, that said, if you combine that with all the tariffs and stuff, I mean, you could really make or Chinese manufacturing, unfathomably expensive to export to America. But then you've got to take into the court the other factors like, the rare earths export halts that China is imposing on rare earths so that America can't access them, right? Like we have to do this like a good movie script, right? Where the villain actually has their own wherewithal and smarts rather than just like some dumb Disney thing where we've got a good idea and the villain doesn't even think about it. We just sort of hit them, right? So sorry, I'm a parent, and so I'm having to watch all sorts of bad children's shows all the time. So maybe that's why it's on my mind. So yeah, look, I really do think they're in a bad position. What I would say is the fact that Donald Trump is so forthright with, tweeting about iPhone tariffs and all that kind of stuff is I do think this is like kind of above the pay grade, if you will, of Apple. As big as Apple is, these things have to be dealt with at a real geopolitical superpower showdown quite level. And so, if there is going to be a breakthrough for, let's say, manufacturing capacity in India, in the United States, with Apple, with Foxconn, etc., playing some role, I think that only happens because it's the Washington, Beijing, New Delhi heads of state coming to some sort of consensus. I mean, I don't know how optimistic one could be about that, but I don't think it's just the fact that, Tim Cook's a savvy guy. You're talking about a corporation versus a very powerful nation. And, one country can make laws and has a military. I mean, the other, a company can't do anything like that. It's not a fair fight, as it were. So the fact that Trump is so invested in the topic means that maybe it is just part of some grand bargain.
Yes, love it. But look, Patrick, it's been a roller coaster of insights and stories and discussions. So love to have you again. Always a delight. I want to encourage everybody to pick up and read the book. You find it all over, really. I mean, it's on the. Didn't you make it on the New York Times?
Yeah, it's been on the New York Times
book.
bestseller list for 3 weeks. It's also a bestseller in Canada, the UK, and Singapore, apparently Hong Kong. Yeah, it is doing really well. My website is appleinchina.com. That's probably pretty easy to remember. And yeah, reach out on LinkedIn if you'd like. Because I know you have a lot of people that understand supply chain, and I'm really interested in these issues. I'm really interested in what I would call industrial statecraft, kind of the intersection of manufacturing policy, tech competition, and national security. Because I really do think when Apple is this big, when it's this sophisticated, and when you've got 90% of its operations in America, in China, we really are dealing with national security issues. And one last thing I would say about the book, I know that this can sound like a real indictment of Apple. If it's an indictment of anything, it's of shareholder first capitalism, the sort of paradigm that would allow Apple to sort of push everything to a country, famous for its lack of high wages, its lack of environmental protections, its lack of worker rights, and so forth. But there are no villains in the narrative. I think it's a pretty fair portrait of everyone from Johnny Ive and Steve Jobs to Tim Cook and everyone else. It's really just a how it happened narrative rather than a polemic. It's certainly not a screed. Virtually all my sources are Apple, and loads of people with Apple experience or that are currently at Apple who were not part of the book have reached out to tell me how much they enjoyed the book. So I just like to put that out there because I know that in 90-second sound bites, I can sound maybe combative and maybe dismissive and so forth. But the book is really written in this like careful, slow, well, not slow because it's pretty fast paced, but it's written in this careful way that really just demonstrates how things happened rather than sort of like holds anyone in particular to account or, puts Tim Cook's feet to the fire or something like that.
Thanks for that disclaimer, Patrick. And I resonate. I definitely take it as a recount of what happened as opposed to a judgment passed on whatever. So on that note, big thanks. Great to have you again, and keep speaking, keep sharing, keep telling people about the story and inspiring them.
Will do. Thanks, Radu. Appreciate it.
Once again, this is Radu Palamariu. Thank you so much for listening to this Leaders in Supply Chain podcast episode. If you're listening it on iTunes, Spotify, or any other channel, we'd love if you leave us a review, and of course, share this with anyone you think might enjoy it. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time.